Coming up today on the Locked On NHL podcast, the Arizona Coyotes starting to fall in the Western Conference playoff picture. The St. Louis Blues continue to shore up their spot as one of the wild card teams. And Connor Bedard getting close to a return to the ice. Is he still the Calder Trophy favorite? All that and more on today's episode of the Locked On NHL podcast. We are your team every day.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome into today's episode of the Locked On NHL podcast. We are your team every day. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On NHL your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode of Locked On NHL is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/locked-on to get started. On today's episode of Locked On NHL, we'll discuss the sinking Arizona Coyotes as they now have lost 6 in a row and are looking more like a seller than a buyer at this year's trade deadline. We'll talk about how the St. Louis Blues continue to keep themselves in the postseason picture, and Connor Bedard getting close to a return to play. We'll check in on the Calder Trophy race as well. My name is Seth Topal, part of the one half of the dynamic duo for your Western Conference Tuesday edition of Locked On NHL. Unfortunately, Nick Morgan under the weather here today, so flying it solo. But we start by taking a look at the Arizona Coyotes, who are starting to take on a little bit of water here at this point in the season. The Coyotes have lost 6 straight games and have only won twice in their last 10. They have lost to the Florida Panthers 6-2, the Tampa Bay Lightning 6-3, 3-1 to the Carolina Hurricanes, 3-2 to the Vegas Golden Knights, 5-4 to the Nashville Predators, and most recently, a loss to the Philadelphia Flyers by a score of 5-3. And the Coyotes go from being just a couple of points out of the playoff picture to now falling further behind than the Minnesota Wild were even a couple of nights ago. The Coyotes now are behind the Seattle Kraken, the Minnesota Wild, the Calgary Flames, and the Nashville Predators, and currently sit 8 points behind the St. Louis Blues for the second wild card spot in the West with the same number of games played. The Coyotes do have a game in hand on Seattle and Minnesota, 2 games on the Flyers, but the Los Angeles Kings in that first wild card spot have 2 games in hand on the Coyotes. So Arizona, 2-6-2 in their last 10, has really started to take on some water. And if you look at some of the chief reasons as to why the Coyotes have not been able to sustain the play that they had earlier in the season, well, you can start and look no further than their goaltending situation over the last couple of weeks. Karel Vejmelka is or was 0-4 in January with a 5.61 goals against average and an .874 save percentage, and only gave up less than 3 goals in one of the games in January. And so obviously for him has been fewer and far in between with starts because Connor Ingram played well enough to take over the starter's role in Arizona. But you look at what Connor Ingram has done over his last few starts. Going back to his last win against the Pittsburgh Penguins, that was a 5-2 win on January 22nd. Since then, he gave up 6 goals to Tampa Bay, 3 goals in a 3-1 loss to Carolina, gave up 3 goals in the first 12 minutes of the game against Vegas, and then gave up 5 goals against Nashville in a 5-4 overtime loss for the Coyotes. And so a really solid goalie combination that saw Ingram, especially in November when he was 7-2, really, really solid play from Connor Ingram to get the Coyotes started. But if you look at how the rest of the team has played here over these last 6 games, you're just not seeing that same consistent level of contribution for many of the key faces that were pivotal in Arizona getting off to a great start. You look at players such as Lawson Cruz, who has just 1 point in the last 6 games. That, of course, was a goal. Many of the other key faces for this Coyotes team just have not been able to provide key contributions over these last few games. You're getting Clayton Keller, who has 7 points in the last 6 during this losing streak. But beyond that, Dylan Guenther, Jason Zucker are right at about a point per game. Beyond that, you just have a bunch of guys who have not been able to help out as consistently as they had earlier in the season. And I know Nick and I talked about this at the beginning of the year, is that we would love to see Arizona sustain this and be one of those teams in the postseason picture at the end of the season. It would be great to see Arizona be able to go on a roll and go on a run to get into the postseason. And look at what Arizona has coming up here before the trade deadline. After they play the Minnesota Wilds at home tomorrow night, they host Carolina on Friday. Then they're at Colorado on Sunday the 18th. Monday the 19th, they host Edmonton. Then they host Toronto, at Winnipeg, at Montreal, at Toronto, at Ottawa, then at Washington and home against Chicago. And then the trade deadline, I believe, is March 8th. So they will host the Wild on March 7th, too, before the trade deadline. But you have a lot of really key games that give you an opportunity to maybe bounce back into this if you can start to consistently pick up some wins. But if not, and you fall further out of the mix, then at that point is when Arizona starts to look more like a seller than a buyer at this point in the season. And it's funny because you look at the teams that are ahead of them in the Western Conference playoff picture right now. The Seattle Kraken, after going on just an unbelievable stretch, they have fallen back down to earth at 2-7-1 in their last 10. Minnesota Wild 7-3 in their last 10, but Calgary is 5-5 and Nashville 4-5-1. And there are rumblings about a few of those teams starting to look to potentially sell off pieces. And so if teams in front of you are saying, yeah, at this point, we may not be best suited to try to continue this run, then the Coyotes are probably going to get to that same point themselves. And look, Arizona's got some intriguing pieces that they would be able to push out at the deadline. I mean, you think about a guy like Nick Bjugstad, who has been a veteran. Edmonton acquired him at the trade deadline last year. He would be a good bottom 6 piece for a playoff contender. Jason Zucker has 8 goals in 41 games. He's got 22 points in 41 games, but still a guy who is capable of scoring and is a vet to add to a team on the playoff push. So there are some pieces for Arizona to where if they do lean sell. You don't have to throw everything on the table, but just a couple of assets that you brought in as free agents that you then can turn around and flip for assets to help out your farm system. So it is unfortunate, but again, if Arizona throughout this upcoming stretch of games can get themselves back on track and pick up some wins against the likes of Edmonton, against the likes of Vancouver, Winnipeg, if you can start to pick up some wins against those teams and get yourself back into it, then that tune changes a little bit. But as of right now, you now have 4 teams that you have to vault, plus the St. Louis Blues in that second wild card spot in order to be able to get back into the playoff conversation, which is easier said than done. But things are starting to look a little dicey for the Arizona Coyotes at this point. Now, on the flip side of that, one team that has continued their winning ways and is amongst the hottest teams in the NHL since the calendar flipped to 2024, the St. Louis Blues. We will take a look at how the Blues continue to push themselves into a playoff spot and what they have done over their recent hot stretch of play. That is all on the way as we continue today's episode of the Locked On NHL podcast after this. Today's episode of Locked On NHL is brought to you by FanDuel. Get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. You can bet on all of your favorite NBA players and teams with quick bets, live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and more. And since we'll be talking about this later in the show, let's just run down the current Calder Trophy odds. Courtesy of FanDuel, Connor Bedard still the favorite at -210. Brock Faber plus 300, followed by Luke Hughes at plus 750. Marco Rossi at plus 1,400. Connor Zary at plus 2,500. And Logan Cooley at plus 4,000. So Bedard's still the betting favorite right now. And if he wins, you could end up with $150 in bonus bets that you can use for all sorts of different parlays and more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to shoot your shot today. FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NBA. Welcome back to today's episode of the Locked On NHL podcast. Once again, we are your team every day, and we thank you for making Locked On NHL your first listen each and every day. Seth Topal flying it solo here today, and if you look at the NHL standings since January 1st, the St. Louis Blues sit tied for 7th in points with 21. They are 10-4-1 since the calendar flipped to 2021. And if you want to go a little further than that and go to strictly February, the St. Louis Blues 2-0 in the 2 games that they have played so far. But dialing back out to just 2024, the Blues have the 8th best mark in the NHL in that span. And you look at some of the other metrics that go along with this. They have scored 45 goals in those 15 games. They've allowed 38, so 3 goals per game, 2.53 goals allowed per game. A power play that is operating currently at 30.4%. Remember the days early in the season when the St. Louis Blues couldn't buy a power play goal? Now they can't get rid of them fast enough. And a penalty kill that is at 79% right now, which is, if you're in the mid-80s, you're pretty good as a penalty killing unit. So it's not a penalty kill group that is actively hurting the St. Louis Blues, but it is fascinating to see how this recent stretch of games has played out for St. Louis, in which they have won 7 out of their last 8 games. And they've beaten the likes of Washington 3-0, the Calgary Flames 4-3, the Vancouver Canucks 4-3, the Seattle Kraken 4-3, the Los Angeles Kings 4-3. The only loss in these last 8 games is a 1-0 loss to the Columbus Blue Jackets, but they followed it up with a 3-1 win over the Sabres and a 7-2 win over the Montreal Canadiens. And so the St. Louis Blues continuing to push themselves into a more solid footing in the playoff picture. And you look at the guys on their squad that have been getting it done here since the calendar flipped to 2021. Robert Thomas with 18 points in 15 games. Jordan Kyrou has 8 goals in the Blues' last 15 games. Braden Shen has 5 goals and 13 total points. Pavel Buchnevich has 5 goals, 12 points in those 15. Jake Neighbors with 6 goals. Colton Parayko with 3 goals. You're even getting Oscar Sundqvist with 3 goals and 3 assists in those 15 games. So they're getting a ton of contributions up and down the lineup. And a Blues team that was struggling to just get those top-level guys to look the part early in the season, now you're having all of those guys hit at the same time. And the goaltending has been really good for the Blues as well. Jordan Binnington closing out the month of January, 6-2-1 with a 2.1 goals against average, a .930 save percentage, and a shutout of the Washington Capitals, in which the St. Louis Blues only surrendered 18 total shots, but took that right into February with a 2 goals allowed performance on 32 shots against the Montreal Canadiens. And you are as good as your backup goalie. Their backup, Joel Hofer, has not been too bad himself, with a win against the Buffalo Sabres on February 10th to contribute in that same vein. And so for a St. Louis Blues team, they were another one of the teams in the West that fired their head coach, Craig Berube, relieved of his duties. And it just seems like St. Louis has been able to find a new gear and a new lease on life. And with the Blues, you look at all these other teams in the Western Conference playoff picture right now. The Los Angeles Kings have started to get themselves back on track. But beyond that, the Nashville Predators, as we just talked about, 4-5-1 in their last 10. Calgary's 5-5. The Wild are 7-3. But then Seattle is 2-7-1. They're going in the wrong direction. Arizona 2-6-2. They're going in the wrong direction. And so St. Louis is seeing the objects in the mirror as being fewer and far in between, to where now you are only having to potentially fend off maybe Nashville, Calgary, and Minnesota. And if they just continue to rack up wins like this, then you're looking at your second wild card spot. And everybody that is a fan of the Blues, people who have covered the Blues, will, I'm sure, remember back to 2019. Just get into the postseason. And this team, if any, is capable of going on that type of a run. It may not be likely, but if anybody knows how to replicate what the 2019 St. Louis Blues did, it's the St. Louis Blues. And so they find themselves pretty solidly entrenched in the postseason picture for right now. As long as they continue to win, they can create some space and put pressure on both the Kings and the Nashville Predators just behind them as well. Speaking of putting pressure on the current front runner, Connor Bedard is nearing a return to the ice. We'll look at what has happened since he was injured and could not play. We'll see how things look with the Calder Trophy race as we finish today's episode of Locked On NHL after this. Today's episode of Locked On NHL is brought to you by Sleeper. We have moved past the halfway point and are rapidly approaching the final push to the postseason. And even if your favorite team is not currently occupying a postseason spot, you can still win big by playing daily fantasy hockey on Sleeper, the official daily fantasy app of the Locked On NHL Network. Sleeper is our number one choice for daily fantasy sports and especially daily fantasy hockey, because with Sleeper, you can win 100 times your cash in daily fantasy hockey contests. All you have to do is pick whether upper echelon elite tier players like Connor McDavid, Alex Ovechkin, Sidney Crosby, or Nathan McKinnon will record more or less than their Sleeper projections for stats such as goals, assists, saves, plus minus, and more in a given game. To win a 100 times bet on Sleeper, you need to correctly predict the outcome of 8 player stats. Use promo code LOCKEDONNHL and you'll get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. That's code LOCKEDONNHL. See Sleeper's terms of use for details and locational availability. Welcome back to today's episode of the Locked On NHL podcast. Once again, we are your team every day. We thank you for making Locked On NHL your first listen each and every day. Connor Bedard is hoping that he can return to action next week after missing 6 weeks with a fractured jaw. The latest from Blackhawks head coach Luke Richardson from Monday. Quote, we're hoping that after the 6-week mark after surgery is when he can come back. So that'll be a week from today, which Richardson said on Monday. So hoping for, at this point, next Monday to be able to return to the action. And we talked about the FanDuel odds as of right now. Connor Bedard still on top at -210, but Brock Faber has really started to close the gap. He's currently at +300, really the closest of the other competitors. Luke Hughes at +750, Marco Rossi at +1400, Connor Zary at +2500, Logan Cooley at +4000, Leo Carlson at +5000. But really, it looks like at this point, it'll be either Bedard or maybe Faber or Hughes as the most likely to win. So looking at the statistics for rookies and just players in general for the current leaders in points, it is still, as of right now, Connor Bedard, who is tied for most points in this season with 33, but Brock Faber has caught him. Now he still leads, Bedard still leads in goals with 15, but Marco Rossi also only 1 goal behind. And if Bedard finishes out the season, he's at 39 games right now. And so with Chicago still having 30 games to play, let's say Bedard plays in, well, whatever they would have left if he comes back on Monday, 28 games. If he plays in the final 28 games of the season, he would end up playing in 67 games. And in those final 28 games, let's say he does get 15 more goals to get to 30 goals on the season. I think the fact that Bedard still has a share of the lead for points amongst rookies, I think gives him the opportunity to reclaim that title. Now, if he comes back and struggles, and isn't performing at that same clip that he was pre-injury, then that is just more of an opportunity for Brock Faber or Luke Hughes to step in and to have an impact. But the thing that I look at as well, and this may just be some of my Minnesota Wild host showing, but you look at the marks for Bedard this year. 1 power play goal, 8 power play points, and is playing on average 19 minutes, 4 seconds on the ice per game. Faber is already has 10 power play points, 2 power play goals. So he's got more than Bedard in both of those categories. He's playing 24 minutes, 59 seconds per game. And with Jared Spurgeon and Jonas Brodin missing large stretches of the season so far, he has been asked to go toe-to-toe with a lot of the top-level guys throughout the course of the NHL. And so I know, again, Connor Bedard is a fantastic generational talent. And so if he finishes with 67-ish games and gets to 30 goals, I think Calder Trophy will be his in a landslide. But it's all going to depend on how he plays when he gets back to the action. And just on a side, I have never experienced the pain of breaking your jaw, fracturing your jaw, and having to have it at least partially wired shut. Hoping that is never the case, because even to get to the point where he was able to be on the ice but could not practice slap shots because they were worried about him clenching his jaw, that's a hard pass from me. But as of right now, I think the closest competitors to Bedard, obviously Brock Faber is one, but you look at what Luke Hughes has done, and he's sitting on 8 goals through 51 games as a defenseman. He's got 12 power play points, 4 power play goals, and he's sitting at 26 points right now. As much as I would like to say Marco Rossi ends up as a finalist as well, I think it will be Bedard. I think it'll be Faber and probably Luke Hughes as finalists, or maybe if somebody like Adam Fantilli or Logan Cooley go on a hot streak, maybe they can vault their way in to finalist status. But Bedard and Faber will be finalists. I feel confident in saying that. It's all about how Bedard does when he returns to the ice, likely on Monday. If he lights it up, if he starts with a hat trick, the Calder Trophy is probably going to end up in his hands when it's all said and done. But we'll wait and see. Chicago's certainly happy to get him back, as they've lost 6 in a row and have just been incapable of scoring goals, more so than they previously were. So they're going to be very happy to get him back in the mix to at least give the fans something to cheer about. That is going to do it for today's episode of Locked On NHL. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On NHL your first listen each and every day. Now that you are done watching today's episode, make sure to hit the like button on YouTube and click subscribe if you have not already, so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week with our great panel of Locked On NHL hosts. You can find new episodes of the Locked On NHL podcast every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.